The clinking of silver against porcelain was the only sound for a full 10 seconds, a fragile metronome marking the time in a room thick with unspoken resentments. Julian felt the silence not as an absence of noise, but as a presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from years of quiet condescension and feigned civility. Across the starched white tablecloth, his wife, Catherine, stared at him. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were not filled with anger, but with a chilling, surgical detachment. They were in a private room at Aurelia, a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign, only a reputation. It was the natural habitat of her family. Her father, Marcus Devereux, a man who wore his wealth like armor. Her mother, Eleanor, whose smiles were as carefully curated as the pearls at her throat, and her brother, Leo, a man perpetually auditioning for the role of his father, armed with a sneer and an expensive watch. They were a portrait of dynastic success, and Julian, in his simple, well-worn tweed jacket, was the smudge on the canvas. Marcus cleared his throat, a sound like gravel being ground under a heel. "Julian," he began, the name itself an accusation. "Leo was just telling us about the Henderson bid. A real coup. Remind me, what have you been working on lately? Still tinkering with those little models?" The insult was a familiar tune, played on a different day. For 10 years, Julian's work as a small-scale, independent architectural consultant had been a source of endless, thinly veiled amusement for the Devereux clan. They saw his refusal to join their corporate behemoth, Devereux Holdings, not as a choice, but as a failure that reflected poorly on Catherine. Julian met his father-in-law's gaze. Just a few projects, Marcus. A community library. A low-income housing initiative. Leo snorted, a sharp, ugly sound. Charity work. How noble. Can't pay the bills with good intentions. Can you, Jules? He winked at his sister, a conspiratorial gesture that cut Julian more deeply than the words themselves. Catherine's hand, which had been resting near her wine glass, clenched into a fist. Julian saw the war inside her, the ingrained loyalty to her family clashing with the fading ghost of the woman she once was, the woman who had claimed to admire his quiet integrity. The loyalty was winning. It always did. "That's enough, Leo," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. It was a token defense, a performance for an audience of one. Herself. The air crackled. The meal was a battlefield, the food a casualty. Eleanor, ever the diplomat of superficiality, tried to steer the conversation. "Catherine, darling, tell us about the foundation gala. I heard the planning committee is a complete mess this year." But Catherine didn't seem to hear her. Her focus was entirely on Julian, her expression hardening into a terrifying resolve. It was the look of someone about to detonate a bomb simply to end the tension. She had been absorbing her family's judgment for a decade, and it had metastasized within her, turning her love into a tumor of resentment. Tonight was the excision. She pushed her chair back slightly, the legs scraping against the polished floor. The sound was unnaturally loud. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice low but carrying the weight of a final verdict. The table fell silent once more. Marcus lowered his fork. Julian waited. He knew this was not a negotiation. It was a pronouncement. Catherine's eyes locked onto his. There was no flicker of doubt, no hint of sorrow. Only the cold, hard certainty of a decision made long ago and finally spoken aloud. "It's not just them," she said, a slight, dismissive wave of her hand indicating her family. "It's you. It's this life. I look at you, and I see everything I settled for." She took a breath, the inhale sharp and cruel. "I never loved you, Julian. Not really. I think I just love the idea of someone like you. It was a mistake." The words landed in the center of the table and lay there, grotesque and undeniable. Leo's smirk widened. Marcus looked vindicated, as if a long-held suspicion had finally been confirmed. Eleanor's face was a mask of practiced sympathy, already calculating the social logistics of a divorce. The humiliation was absolute, a public execution staged for the benefit of his tormentors. They all watched him, waiting for him to crumble, to protest, to beg. They expected shame, anger, pleading. Julian did none of those things. He simply held her gaze, his own expression unreadable, a deep, calm ocean beneath her manufactured storm. He felt a profound, aching sadness, not for himself, but for her, for the woman she had traded for this brittle, empty performance of status. For a moment, he let the silence stretch, allowing the full weight of her declaration to settle in the room, to be witnessed and absorbed by the people who had engineered it. He noted the satisfaction on Marcus's face, the smug triumph on Leo's. He would remember them. Then, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the oppressive atmosphere with the precision of a scalpel. It was calm, measured, devastating. "I know," he said. Catherine faltered. This was not the reaction she had anticipated. Her script had called for a scene, for tears, for a fight that would validate her decision. His quiet acceptance was a mirror, and she did not like the reflection. He continued, his tone still impossibly serene. "I've known for about 7 years," he paused, letting that sink in. "But your father's CFO, Mr. Albright? He's loved me for the last 3 inch." The shift in the room was seismic. It was as if the laws of gravity had been momentarily suspended. Leo's smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. Eleanor's practiced expression broke, revealing a flicker of genuine alarm. Marcus's eyes narrowed. A predator, suddenly realizing the scent it was tracking might not be prey. Catherine just stared, her mind scrambling to process the non sequitur. Her father's CFO? What did that have to do with anything? What are you talking about? Julian's gaze shifted from her to her father. A silent conversation passed between them, one that Marcus suddenly seemed desperate to lose. "What are you talking about, Julian?" Catherine demanded again, her voice rising with a note of hysteria. Julian's reply was soft, almost a whisper, yet it was the loudest sound she had ever heard. "I'm talking about Devereaux Holdings. I'm talking about the fact that it is, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. And I'm talking about the man who has been secretly keeping it afloat." He gave a slight, ironic smile. "I'm talking about me." The silence that followed was different. It was not heavy. It was sharp, crystalline, and fragile. It was the silence of a world fracturing. And in that deafening quiet, Catherine's hand, which had been hovering over her wine glass, spasmed. The crystal stem slipped through her trembling fingers. It hit the edge of the table and fell, seeming to hang in the air for an eternity before shattering on the floor, the sound echoing the complete and utter demolition of her world. We've all been there, in a room where we felt small, underestimated, or unseen. Maybe it wasn't a fancy dinner. Maybe it was a meeting at work or a conversation with family. But that feeling, that sting of being misjudged, is universal. If you've ever dreamed of a moment where the tables were turned, where your true worth was suddenly and dramatically revealed, then you're in the right place. We'd love to hear where you're watching from today, to know who is on this journey with us. Let us know in the comments. And if you want to see how Julian navigates this ultimate reversal of fortune, make sure you stick around, like this video, and subscribe for more stories that remind us that still waters often run deepest. Now, let's go back and see how this all began. 11 years earlier, the air in the small, independent bookstore had smelled of old paper and brewing coffee. Catherine Devereaux had been hiding from a sudden downpour, annoyed and impatient, scrolling through her phone. Then she saw him. He was sitting in a worn armchair, a heavy book of structural engineering open in his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was sketching in a small Moleskine notebook, his concentration so absolute that the world around him seemed to have faded away. He had a quiet intensity, a self-contained stillness that was the complete antithesis of the loud, performative men in her social circle. She found herself walking over, an impulse she couldn't explain. "What are you designing?" she asked. He looked up, and his eyes, a warm and steady shade of brown, held a flicker of surprise before settling into a gentle smile. "A bridge," he said, "but one that doesn't feel like a cage. More like a path held up by the air." His name was Julian Vance. He was an architect, but he spoke of buildings as if they were living things with souls and purposes beyond mere function. They talked for 3 hours until the rain stopped and the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows through the bookstore window. For Catherine, raised in a world where value was measured in square footage and stock prices, Julian's passion was an exotic and intoxicating language. He didn't talk about money or status. He talked about light and space, and how a building could make a person feel safe or inspired or at peace. She fell for him, or rather, for the idea of him. He was her rebellion. He was authentic, a word her friends used with a certain ironic detachment, but which she, for a time, believed in. When she brought him home to meet her family, it was with a sense of defiant pride. The Devereux estate was less a home and more a declaration of dominance over the landscape. It was a neoclassical monolith of limestone and glass that loomed over its manicured gardens. Marcus Devereux greeted Julian with a handshake that was less a welcome and more a test of strength. "Julian," Marcus had said, his eyes sweeping over Julian's simple attire. "Catherine tells me you're an architect. I'm in real estate, you know. We build things. Big things." The implication was clear. You design, we build. You dream, we act. Throughout that first dinner, Julian was subjected to a polite but rigorous interrogation. What firm was he with? What were his most notable projects? His answers, that he worked for himself, that he focused on smaller, community-oriented designs, were met with faint, condescending smiles. A noble pursuit, Marcus had conceded, the same phrase he would use like a weapon for the next decade. But there's no legacy in a library, son. Legacy is written on the skyline. Julian had remained unflappable, answering their questions with a calm sincerity that seemed to only irritate them more. Catherine, at that stage, was still his fierce defender. "Dad, Julian's work has meaning. It helps people. It's not all about profit." "Everything is about profit, sweetheart," Marcus had replied, patting her hand. "That's the lesson you learn when you have something to lose." Their wedding, a year later, was the first major crack in the facade. It was a Devereux production, extravagant, impersonal, and designed to project power. Julian had wanted a small ceremony, but Catherine, eager to please her family and prove that her choice wasn't a step down, had agreed to the spectacle. During the reception, Marcus gave a toast. He spoke of his love for his daughter, of his hopes for her future. Then he turned his attention to Julian. "And to Julian," he said, raising his glass, "a man of principles. We all hope he can one day build a career as grand as the life Catherine is accustomed to." But in the meantime, he added with a booming laugh that invited the guests to join in, "Welcome to the family. Don't worry, we'll take care of you." The room filled with polite, knowing laughter. It was a public branding, a coronation of Julian as the family's resident charity case. Catherine's face flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and, for the first time, a flicker of shame. She looked at Julian, expecting to see him humiliated. Instead, he was perfectly still, a small, private smile on his lips. He met her eyes and gave her a reassuring wink. But as Marcus continued to speak, Julian's left hand, unseen by the crowd, slipped into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. His fingers brushed against the smooth, worn leather of a slim portfolio. It was a gesture of reassurance, a silent communion with a secret no one in that room could possibly imagine. Inside that portfolio was not the deed to a small house or a modest stock certificate. It was the founding document for a company called Argent Structures, LLC, registered in Delaware 2 years prior. It was a company that, at that very moment, was worth more than the entire Devereux empire combined. He had taken Catherine's last name, Vance, as a gesture of love, but also as a cloak. His real name, Julian Thorne, was known only to a handful of the most powerful venture capitalists in the world, the ones who had paid him a fortune for his revolutionary architectural logistics software, Ethel, 5 years before he ever met Catherine. He touched the portfolio, a silent promise to himself: patience. The game had not even begun. The years that followed were a masterclass in sustained humiliation, a slow, methodical erosion of his perceived worth. The Devereaux operated with the casual cruelty of people who had never been told no. They seemed to take a perverse pleasure in reminding Julian of his dependent status, a status that was entirely of their own invention. There was the summer garden party for the Devereaux Foundation, where Marcus, in front of a sitting congressman, had clapped Julian on the shoulder and said, "If you need a drink, ask Julian. He's not busy." He'd said it with a jovial laugh, as if it were a joke, but the message was clear. Julian, without a word, had simply smiled and spent the next hour making sure everyone's glass was full, his service so impeccable and graceful that several guests later commented to Eleanor on her wonderfully professional staff. The barb had not landed as Marcus intended. It had simply exposed his own boorishness. Then there was the Christmas when Leo gave Julian his gift, a high-end, leather-bound daily planner. "Thought you could use this to keep track of all your job interviews," Leo had sneered, to the amusement of the assembled family. Catherine had flinched but said nothing, her silence a sharp betrayal. Julian had accepted the gift with a gracious nod. "Thank you, Leo. That's very thoughtful." The next day, he used the first page of the planner to map out the final stages of a debt acquisition strategy against a failing European subsidiary of Devereaux Holdings, a move that would, in 3 years, give him a critical leverage point. The irony was a small, private comfort. Catherine was the fulcrum of his pain. She was both a victim and a perpetrator, trapped between the man she had once admired and the family whose approval she craved. Her defense of him grew weaker over time, eventually vanishing altogether, replaced by a frustrated, critical silence. She began to echo her family's criticisms. "Why don't you just join my father's firm?" she'd ask late at night, her voice laced with a familiar weariness. "You're brilliant, Julian. You could be running the entire development division in 5 years. We could have a real life, a partnership." "We have a life, Catherine," he would reply softly, looking up from the blueprints of a pro bono project he was designing for a children's hospital. "A good one." "This isn't a life," she would snap. "This is a hobby. My family supports us. My father pays the mortgage on this house. My mother pays for our vacations. You live in a world of drawings and ideas while I live in the real world, where people judge me because my husband refuses to grow up." He never corrected her. He never told her that the house had been paid off in cash, in her name, from an anonymous trust he had established the day they were married. He never told her that the vacations were funded by dividend payments from investments he managed through a labyrinth of shell corporations. He let her believe the narrative her family had crafted, because to tell her the truth would have been to reveal the game before it was time to play. Revealing his wealth would not have fixed the deeper problem, her valuing of wealth over worth. So he waited, and he watched, and he endured. His nights became his sanctuary. After Catherine was asleep, he would go to his study, a room she saw as a refuge for his failed ambitions. He would lock the door, not to work on architectural models, but to command a hidden empire. On a shielded, multi-monitor setup that looked like a professional trading desk, he would communicate with his team, his wealth manager in Zurich, his legal counsel in New York, and his small, elite team of analysts. He was not tinkering, he was orchestrating. He tracked every move Devereaux Holdings made. He saw their arrogant, high-risk expansions. He saw Leo's reckless gambling on volatile markets. He saw Marcus's pride-fueled refusal to adapt to a changing industry. They were building a house of cards on a foundation of debt, and they were too proud to see it. And Julian, the quiet, unassuming man they mocked, was methodically, patiently buying the ground out from under them. He did it through proxies and third-party firms, a ghost in the financial machine. He wasn't just protecting his investment. He was preparing for a reckoning. It wasn't about revenge, not in the petty sense. It was about justice. It was about holding a mirror up to the Devereaux family and forcing them to see the rot at their core. One evening, about a year before the dinner at Aurelia, Catherine came into his study without knocking. He minimized the complex financial charts just in time, bringing up a 3D rendering of the community library. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of disappointment. "My father just closed the Shanghai deal," she said flatly. "They're celebrating at the club. He asked why you weren't there." "He didn't invite me, Catherine," Julian said calmly. "You should have just come. You're part of this family," she retorted, her logic twisted by years of cognitive dissonance. "You just sit in here with your little projects, hiding. Don't you see how it looks?" He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, he considered telling her everything. He considered showing her the statements, the deeds, the sheer, staggering scale of his true life. He wanted to shake her and say, "None of this is real. Your father's Shanghai deal is leveraged with money that is ultimately mine. The club where they are celebrating is on land owned by a real estate trust one control. You are living in a gilded cage I have the only key to." But he held his tongue. The pain in her eyes was real, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that revealing the truth now would be an act of cruelty, not kindness. She wasn't ready to understand. She had to arrive at the precipice on her own. She had to choose to jump. He simply nodded. "I am sorry, Catherine. I'll make more of an effort." His apology, his quiet capitulation, was the final confirmation she needed. In her eyes, he was weak, a man who would not fight for his own dignity. Her love, already withered, finally turned to dust. And as she walked away, her back rigid with contempt, Julian turned back to his screens. He brought up a file labeled Devereaux Holdings, Phase 4, the catalyst. It was time to let her brother, Leo, make his final, fatal mistake. The catalyst arrived in the form of a company called Helios Renewables. It was a speculative venture in green energy technology that was, to any seasoned analyst, a house of smoke and mirrors. But Leo Devereaux, desperate to outshine his father and prove his own genius, saw it as his ticket to legendary status. He convinced Marcus to leverage a massive portion of Devereaux Holdings' remaining assets to acquire a controlling stake. It was a bold, reckless move, hailed by the sycophantic business press as visionary. Julian knew better. His team had analyzed Helios 6 months prior and had flagged it as a catastrophic risk, a company built on fraudulent patents and cooked books. He watched Leo lead the Devereaux family over a cliff with the detached fascination of a physicist watching an object in terminal velocity. He could have intervened. A single anonymous call to a financial regulator would have stopped the deal. But that would have been a rescue, and the Devereaux were long past the point of being rescued. They needed to learn the gravity of their own actions. The collapse came faster than even Julian had anticipated. Within 4 months of the acquisition, the fraud at the heart of Helios was exposed by an investigative journalist. The company's stock flatlined in a single day, becoming utterly worthless. The news sent shockwaves through the financial world. Devereaux Holdings, which had used its own stock as collateral for the loans to buy Helios, was suddenly facing a cascade of margin calls. The banks that had once courted Marcus now circled him like sharks. The panic at the Devereaux estate was palpable. The grand home, once a symbol of unassailable power, now felt like a tomb. Shouting matches echoed through the marble halls. Marcus, his face a ghastly shade of gray, roared at Leo, who had retreated into a state of sullen, defensive silence. Eleanor floated through the house like a ghost, her social calendar wiped clean, her phone suddenly silent. Their only hope was a buyout from a longtime rival, Sterling Price. The terms offered were brutal. Sterling Price would absorb the Devereaux assets, dissolve the name, and offer Marcus and Leo transitional consulting roles, a gilded term for a public firing. It was complete and total surrender. For Marcus, a man whose entire identity was built on the Devereaux name, it was a fate worse than death. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that Catherine called Julian. He was at the construction site of the community library, watching a steel beam being hoisted into place against a clear blue sky. "We're having a family dinner tonight," she said, her voice strained and brittle. "At Aurelia. You need to be there." "Why?" Julian asked, his voice even. "Because we need to present a united front," she cried, her voice cracking. "My father, the company, it's all a mess. We have to look strong. We have to look like a family. Please, Julian, just for tonight, just play the part. Play the part." The irony was so thick, it was almost suffocating. For 10 years, he had played the part of the meek, unsuccessful husband. Now, in their darkest hour, they needed him to uphold the lie for their own benefit. "I'll be there, Catherine," he said. He looked at the library taking shape, a structure built with care and purpose, meant to stand for 100 years. Then he thought of the Devereux Empire, a glittering mirage about to evaporate. He felt a quiet, grim sense of finality. The game was over. The checkmate was on the board. Tonight, he would stop playing the part. He would simply be himself. And that, he knew, would be the most shocking role of all. The private dining room at Aurelia was a study in beige and gold, a cocoon of luxury designed to insulate its occupants from the harsh realities of the world. Tonight, however, the insulation had failed. The reality was in the room, sitting at the table, a guest that could not be ignored. It was in the way Marcus stared at his untouched plate of seared scallops, his mind clearly a million miles away, calculating losses. It was in the nervous tick in Leo's jaw, the frantic, repetitive motion of a man trapped in a cage of his own making. It was in Eleanor's desperate, brittle attempts at small talk, which evaporated into the tense silence. Julian ate his meal with a slow, deliberate calm. He tasted the saffron in the risotto, noted the crispness of the asparagus. He was the only one in the room who was truly present. He felt like a seismologist sitting beside a fault line, feeling the deep, telltale tremors that preceded the earthquake, while everyone else was still admiring the view. They were trying to pretend this was a normal family dinner, a show of solidarity before the Sterling Price deal was finalized the next day. It was a pathetic, transparent charade. Finally, Marcus pushed his plate away, the sound of porcelain on linen a signal that the performance was over. He tinted his fingers, a gesture Julian had seen him use 100 times in boardrooms and negotiations. It was a pose of power, of control. Tonight, it looked like a caricature. "Family," Marcus began, his voice raspy. "We are facing a challenge. The markets have been unkind. We have been the victims of a vicious, coordinated attack." He glanced at Leo, whose face was pale. "Mistakes were made, but the Devereux name is resilient. We have weathered storms before, and we will weather this 1 inch." He was building a narrative of noble defeat, of victimization. He was incapable of genuine introspection. It was never his fault, merely his misfortune. The deal with Sterling Price is a strategic merger, a partnership that will allow the Devereux legacy to continue under a new banner. He lied, his voice gaining a semblance of its old, booming confidence. He was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Then his eyes fell on Julian. In the landscape of his crumbling world, Marcus needed a scapegoat, a target for the rage and humiliation he could not direct at himself. He saw Julian quiet, unassuming, and in his mind, useless. A perfect repository for his contempt. A cruel, humorless smile touched Marcus's lips. "And through all this, we take care of our own." He looked directly at Julian. "Don't you worry, Julian. When this is all settled, I'll find a place for you. The mailroom, perhaps. Or inventory. Something you can handle. We won't let Catherine's husband be out on the street." It was the final, most exquisite humiliation. Offered a menial job out of pity, in front of his wife, by the man who had systematically belittled him for a decade. It was meant to be the final nail in the coffin of his dignity. Leo smirked, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. This, at least, was a familiar pleasure, the mockery of Julian. Julian slowly placed his fork and knife on his plate, the silver making a soft, final click. He took a sip of water. He looked at Marcus, then at Leo, then at Eleanor. He saw their faces, masks of condescension and schadenfreude. Finally, he looked at his wife, and he saw nothing. The woman he had fallen in love with in a dusty bookstore was gone. In her place was a stranger, her face etched with a decade of resentment, her eyes reflecting her father's cold appraisal. It was in that moment that she broke. Pushed by her father's final, brutal act of dominance and her own festering disappointment, she spoke the words that would sever the last thread between them. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice a low, trembling wire of sound. "It's not just them. It's you. It's this life. I look at you, and I see everything I settled for." Her breath hitched. "I never loved you, Julian. Not really. I think I just loved the idea of someone like you. It was a mistake." The declaration hung in the air, a poison gas. This was the climax of their narrative. The moment the Devereaux were proven right. The moment their daughter finally came to her senses and shed the dead weight of her unfortunate marriage. They all watched Julian, a pack of wolves waiting for the wounded animal to cry out. But Julian did not cry out. He felt a strange, detached calm settle over him. The pain was an old, familiar ache, but tonight it was accompanied by something new. Release. The lie was finally over. The pretense had been shed. All that was left was the truth. He met Catherine's cold stare. "I know," he said, his voice a quiet island in the sea of her drama. She recoiled slightly. "What?" "I've known for about 7 years," he continued, his tone conversational. "I believe it was right after your father forgot to invite me to the family retreat in Aspen, and you told me it was probably for the best, as I wouldn't have had anything to contribute to the conversation." He saw a flicker of confused memory in her eyes. She had said that. "But what you don't know," Julian went on, his voice dropping even lower, drawing them all in, "is that your family's love, or lack thereof, is irrelevant. It was never a factor in my calculations." He shifted his gaze to Marcus, whose face was now a thundercloud of suspicion. "Your opinion of me, Marcus, has always been a liability. But your CFO, Mr. Albright, he's loved me for the last 3 years. Ever since I became the sole owner of the private debt fund that holds the note on your corporate headquarters." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a chess player who has just realized he was not playing against a novice, but against a grandmaster who had been planning this exact move from the very beginning. Catherine's face was a canvas of disbelief. What are you talking about?" Julian reached into the inside pocket of his simple tweed jacket, the same jacket they had mocked 1,000 times. He pulled out the worn leather portfolio. It looked unassuming, old, perhaps filled with the sketches of the libraries and community centers they so disdained. He placed it on the table with a soft thud that resonated like a judge's gavel. "I'm talking about Devereaux Holdings," he said, his eyes sweeping over their stunned faces. "I'm talking about the fact that it is, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. And I'm talking about the man who has been secretly keeping it afloat." He undid the simple clasp on the portfolio and slid out a single, crisp document. He pushed it across the table toward Marcus. He gave a slight, ironic smile, the first genuine smile they had seen from him in years. "I'm talking about me." Marcus stared at the document, as if it were a venomous snake. His hand trembled as he reached for it. The heading was stark and unambiguous. Controlling Share Acquisition, Argent Structures, LLC, and Devereaux Holdings Argent Structures. The name meant nothing to Catherine or Eleanor, but Julian saw the blood drain from Marcus's face. He saw the dawning, horrific recognition in Leo's eyes. They knew that name. It was the name of the mysterious, aggressive investment firm that had been buying up their debt on the secondary market for years, the firm their advisors had warned them about, the one they had dismissed as a vulture fund. "You," Marcus whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "It can't be." "Oh, it can," Julian said, his voice still unervingly calm. He began to lay out more documents from the portfolio, fanning them across the table like a winning hand of cards. Each one was a nail in the coffin of their arrogance. "Let's start at the beginning, shall we? 10 years ago, just before Catherine and I were married, Devereaux Holdings was on the verge of its first quiet collapse after your disastrous venture into South American mining. You were over-leveraged, and the banks were calling in their loans. You needed a silent partner, an angel investor, but no reputable firm would touch you." He paused, letting the memory surface in Marcus's horrified eyes. "Except one, a newly formed private equity group, flush with cash from the tech sector. A group so secretive no one knew who was behind it. They gave you the $50 million that saved you. The price was steep, a significant chunk of non-voting shares and options to convert that debt to voting shares under specific default conditions. You were desperate, so you signed. He tapped the first document. I formed Argent Structures 2 months after I sold my software company, Ethel. That was my money, Marcus. You've been working for me from the very beginning. Catherine made a small, choking sound. Ethel? The Ethel? The program that runs half the logistics for every major construction firm in the world? The one that sold for $1 billion. $950 million after taxes, Julian corrected gently. I was a very private young man. The sale was subject to a strict 7-year non-disclosure agreement. It was a condition I insisted upon. I wanted a quiet life. He looked at Catherine, a deep sadness in his eyes. I wanted a real life. I thought I could have that with you. He turned back to the table, his voice hardening. Over the past decade, every time you made a reckless move, I was there to buy the resulting debt. When you bought that failing textile mill in North Carolina 3 years ago, Argent Structures bought the bonds from the original creditors for pennies on the dollar. When Leo decided to short the commodities market and needed a fast, high-interest bridge loan 2 years ago, that was routed through 3 different shell corporations, but it came from me. And the Helios Renewables deal, that was the final default condition. He slid another paper forward. The terms of the original agreement were clear. Any acquisition that leveraged more than 40% of the company's total valuation without the express written consent of Argent Structures would trigger a full conversion of all held debt and non-voting shares into a controlling majority of voting shares. Leo's folly didn't just bankrupt you. It handed me the keys to the kingdom. He leaned back in his chair. You are not being bought out by sterling price tomorrow, Marcus. Because as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, when the market closed, Devereaux Holdings ceased to exist as an independent entity. It is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Argent Structures, which is to say it is mine. He delivered a list of grievances, not with anger, but with the cold, precise finality of an audit. You offer me a job in the mailroom, Marcus. A fitting irony, since for the last 5 years, I've been personally approving the 7-figure salary you draw from a company I own. You laughed at my charity work, Leo, while I used the profits from your father's company to fund 2 hospitals and a shelter for the homeless. You, he said, his gaze finally resting on Catherine, told me I was a mistake. You mourn a life of status and wealth you thought you'd lost by marrying me, when in fact your entire world, every dress, every vacation, every drop of wine in that shattered glass on the floor, was paid for by the man you so thoroughly despised. The room was a vacuum, all the air sucked out by the sheer magnitude of his revelation. Marcus was slumped in his chair, his face ashen, looking like a king who had just been informed he was, and always had been, a jester. Leo was staring at the documents, his mind unable to comprehend the scale of his own stupidity. Eleanor was weeping silently, not for her husband or her son, but for the loss of her standing, the only thing that had ever truly mattered to her. And Catherine was broken. The world she had built, the sacrifices she thought she had made, the resentments she had nurtured, it was all a lie. She had not married down. She had married so far above her station that she couldn't even see the summit. Her cruelty was not the lashing out of a superior woman trapped with an inferior man. It was the clueless pecking of a barnyard chicken at the feet of an eagle. No, Marcus stammered, a final, desperate act of denial. No, you're a liar, a fraud. This is some kind of elaborate forgery. He lunged across the table, his hand reaching for the papers, his face contorted in a mask of rage. I wouldn't do that, Marcus, a new voice said, crisp and authoritative. The door to the private room opened. A woman stood there, impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit. She was in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of absolute, unshakable confidence. It was Evelyn Reed, a lawyer so legendary in corporate circles that her name was usually spoken in hushed, reverent tones. She was known as the architect for her ability to structure deals so complex and ironclad that they were things of legal beauty. She walked into the room, her heels clicking decisively on the floor. She gave a warm, respectful nod to Julian. "Mr. Thorne, I trust I'm not too early." "Thorne." The name echoed in the silence. Julian Thorne, his real name. The final piece of the puzzle. "Evelyn, your timing is, as always, perfect," Julian said, rising slightly from his chair. Evelyn Reed placed her briefcase on an empty chair and opened it. "Marcus," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You know who I am. For the past 10 years, I have been the lead counsel for Argent Structures. Every document on this table is my work. They are legally inviolable." She pulled out a thick, bound folder and placed it in the center of the table. "This is the final prospectus for the dissolution of the Devereaux Holdings Board of Directors, effective immediately. It also contains severance agreements for you and Leo." She looked at them with something bordering on pity. "They are standard, not generous." She then turned to Julian. "The press release is scheduled for 8 a.m. tomorrow. It frames the transition as a strategic restructuring led by you, the company's long-term silent partner, to steer it in a new, more sustainable direction. It's a flattering narrative. It paints you as the savior, not the conqueror." The legal and financial reality was now absolute, buttressed by the most feared lawyer in the city. The fight was over. The Devereaux dynasty had not just fallen. It had been revealed as a hollow facade, a puppet show whose strings were held by the one man they had never even seen. Marcus stared at Evelyn, then at Julian, his mind finally grasping the full, horrifying truth. He had not been a king. He had been a steward, and a poor one at that, in a kingdom he never knew belonged to another. He made a guttural sound, a mix of a sob and a roar, and slumped forward, his head in his hands. Catherine looked from her shattered father to the calm, commanding man she had married and never known, the man she had just publicly disemboweled. "Julian," she whispered, the name a question, a plea, a lament. "Why?" Julian looked at her, and the cold, strategic mask fell away for a moment, revealing the deep, profound wound beneath. "Because I loved you," he said, his voice quiet and heavy with the weight of that truth. "And I wanted you to love me. Not my money, not my name, not my power. Just me, the man in the bookstore. I gave you 10 years to see him, Catherine, but you never even looked." He turned to Evelyn. "I think we're done here." He walked out of the room without a backward glance, leaving the ruins of the Devereaux family to contemplate the rubble of a world they had built and he had just claimed. The weeks that followed were a blur of seismic shifts, both public and private. The financial news media exploded with the story of the enigmatic Julian Thorne, the ghost of Wall Street, who had emerged from a decade of silence to claim one of the city's oldest corporate empires. The narrative Evelyn Reed had crafted was masterful. Julian was portrayed as a patient visionary who had finally stepped in to save a legacy firm from the reckless mismanagement of its hereditary leadership. Marcus and Leo Devereaux were not just ousted. They were publicly neutered, their reputations shredded. The Grand Devereaux estate was sold to cover personal debts Marcus had accrued against it. He and Eleanor moved into a modest condominium, a place so lacking in grandeur that it felt, to them, like a prison. The fall from grace was absolute. Their phones remained silent. Their invitations ceased. They had not been loved for their wit or charm, but for their power, and now that the power was gone, they were ghosts in a city that had once been their kingdom. Leo, stripped of his title and inheritance, drifted, a man without purpose or identity. Catherine was cast adrift. She had lost everything in a single, shattering moment. Her family's name was disgraced. Her wealth had evaporated, revealed to be an illusion. And her husband, the man she now understood to be the most formidable person she had ever known, was gone. The house they had shared, which she now knew he had owned all along, was sold. He had given her a generous settlement, delivered through lawyers, enough to live comfortably but not lavishly. It was a clean, surgical cut. She moved into a small apartment downtown. The silence was the loudest thing in it. In the quiet, the truth of her own choices began to surface. She replayed a decade of memories, but now with the devastating clarity of hindsight. Every condescending remark from her father, every sneer from her brother, every moment she had stood by and said nothing, they all played in a torturous loop. She saw Julian, not as the failure she had painted him, but as a man of impossible patience and dignity, enduring 1,000 cuts while secretly holding the sword. Her declaration at the restaurant, "I never loved you," haunted her. She realized now it was the greatest lie she had ever told. She had loved him. She had loved the quiet man in the bookstore with all her heart. But she had been too weak, too insecure, too indoctrinated in her family's toxic value system to honor that love. She had allowed their poison to kill it. After a month of crippling solitude, she did the hardest thing she had ever done. She found the number for Julian's new office, the gleaming headquarters of the newly rebranded Thorn Structures, and she called his assistant. She didn't ask for money or for a reconciliation. She just asked for 5 minutes of his time. To her surprise, he agreed. They met in a public park, on a bench overlooking a duck pond. It was a neutral space, a world away from the opulent prisons of their past life. Julian looked different. He wore the same simple style of clothes, but he wore them with a new air of purpose. The quiet stillness was still there, but it was now overlaid with a relaxed confidence. He was no longer hiding. "Thank you for meeting me," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Catherine," he said, his tone polite but distant. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Sorry feels ridiculously small." "It is," he agreed, not unkindly. "But it's a start. I needed to see you," she continued, tears welling in her eyes. To tell you that I see it now. All of it. What you did, how you must have felt, what I did, what I let them do." She looked at him, her face a mess of shame and regret. "I was a coward, Julian. I was so afraid of not being a Devereaux that I forgot how to be a person. I traded a man of true worth for a name that was worthless." This was the moral mirror he had been waiting for. Not an apology born of desperation, but a confession born of self-awareness. He listened, his expression unreadable. "The man in the bookstore," she whispered. "I loved him. I did. I let them convince me he wasn't enough." Julian was silent for a long time, watching the ducks glide across the water. The anger he had held for so long had dissipated, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. He saw the woman before him not as his tormentor, but as another victim of the Devereaux legacy. "The world is full of noise, Catherine," he said finally, his voice soft. "It's easy to get lost in it. Your family's noise was just louder than most. The real tragedy is that you chose to listen to them instead of to yourself." "Is there any hope for me?" she asked, the question raw and vulnerable. "For us." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were kind but firm. "There is hope for you, Catherine. You are intelligent and capable. You can build a life for yourself, a real one, on your own terms. A life where your worth isn't tied to a name or a bank account." He paused. "But there is no us. That story is over. We can't build a future on a foundation of ruins. Some things, once broken, can't be perfectly repaired. They can only be remembered." Her tears fell freely now, but they were tears of acceptance, not protest. She had expected anger, and he had given her a truth that was far more painful and far more liberating. He was not punishing her. He was setting her free. He stood up. "I wish you well, Catherine. Truly." He walked away, leaving her on the bench with the hard, necessary truth and the first, terrifying glimmer of a new beginning. 6 months passed. The name Thorn Structures became synonymous with innovation and integrity. Julian's firm took on ambitious projects, but they were projects with a purpose: a state-of-the-art medical research facility, a new school of performing arts in an underserved neighborhood, a revolutionary green housing development that would set a new standard for sustainable living. He was on the cover of architectural magazines, not for his wealth, but for his vision. He had finally found a way to write a legacy on the skyline, but it was a legacy of his own design, built on his own principles. He was happy, not in a loud, triumphant way, but in a deep, quiet, and centered way. He was the man in the bookstore, but now the world could see the cathedrals in his mind. One crisp autumn afternoon, he was walking near a small gallery in a quiet part of the city. A painting in the window caught his eye, a simple, evocative landscape. He went inside. As he was speaking to the gallery owner, he heard a familiar voice. "It's a beautiful piece, isn't it? The artist has a wonderful sense of light." He turned. It was Catherine. She looked different. Her clothes were simple but elegant. The desperate, haunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a calm clarity. She was working at the gallery, not as an owner, but as an assistant manager. She had found a job, a small life, surrounded by the art she had always genuinely loved, but had previously only seen as an asset class. She saw him, and a flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a small, genuine smile. There was no awkwardness, no lingering resentment. "Julian," she said. "Catherine, you look well," he replied, and he meant it. "I'm happy," she said, and he could see that she meant it too. "It's a quiet life, but it's mine." They spoke for a few minutes about the art, about the weather, about nothing and everything. It was the easy, natural conversation of two people who had a shared history but were no longer bound by it. The pain had faded into a scar, a reminder of a past that had shaped them both. As he was leaving, he turned back to her. "I'm glad you found your way, Catherine." "Me too," she said softly. "And Julian? Thank you. Not for the money, for the truth. It was a harsh gift, but it was the one I needed." He nodded, a final gesture of closure, and walked out of the gallery and into the afternoon sun, a man at peace with his past and in command of his future. He had not sought revenge. He had sought balance. And in the end, he had found it. The scales had been righted, not through cruelty, but through the simple, unassailable power of the truth. The greatest structures, he knew, were not built of steel and glass, but of integrity. And that was a foundation that could never be shaken. What a journey. It reminds us that a person's true value is never what you see on the surface. It's in their character, their integrity, and their quiet strength. The world is full of people who mistake volume for value and arrogance for strength. But as Julian's story shows, patience and principle are the most powerful forces of all. We have a question for you all. Do you believe someone like Catherine deserves a second chance at happiness after causing so much pain? Is her realization an attempt to build a new life enough for redemption? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you were moved by Julian's journey from frustration to vindication, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of emotional truth and satisfying justice. We have many more stories to tell, and we can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, remember to value the quiet ones. They're often the ones holding all the cards.